Okay, let's start the webinar. I would encourage people to still let us know through the chat box who you are and where you're from. I see more and more people joining. Our topic today is integrating variable renewables in the grid, which is a very live and important topic for many people around the world. There are many people trying to figure out how best to integrate variable renewables. And we have two very good presenters here today. Jenny Jorgensen from NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the US, and Daniel Russo from Irena, the International Renewable Energy Agency, and Daniel is based in Bonn. So first I'll ask Jenny to make her presentation. And then Daniel will follow. And after they've presented, it will be open to questions and answers from everybody. And you'll see you have a Q&A box in which you can send questions at any time you like. At any time it occurs to you to send a question, I encourage everybody to think of questions that they would like to get answers to from the expert presenters that we have. So Jenny, please go ahead. Please introduce yourself and let us see your presentation.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Can you see me and hear me and everything?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. Okay, as you mentioned, I am Jenny Jorgensen. I am an engineer at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory here in Golden, Colorado in the US. And I've been an engineer with the lab for about the last 6 years. And today I'm going to be talking about the lessons learned from all of the NREL integration studies with a particular focus on those that have occurred during my tenure here. So as we're all probably aware, the US power system is changing. We're seeing increased generation from the natural gas fleet. That's driven in part by more efficient extraction techniques that have driven down the price of natural gas here. And likewise, we're also seeing an increase in renewable generation, particularly wind and solar, also driven by cost reductions from that side, but also in part driven by favorable policies. So this pie chart kind of illustrates the change that's happened between the years 2000 and 2016. And it just sort of indicates a pretty dramatic shift in our electricity mix, considering the US power system is typically thought of as an industry that is slow to change. But as this sort of rapid transition started to occur, NREL began to evaluate the impacts of the shifts in where our electricity comes from, and specifically the impact of renewables on the grid. One of the first integration studies that came out during my tenure here at NREL looked at the impact of variable renewable energy resources, or VRE resources, on conventional generation. So the concern at the time was that thermal generation, cycling the thermal generation in order to accommodate the generation from VRE sources was basically going to cost so much and increase emissions so much from the fossil fuel fleet that it would negate the impacts of variable generation on the grid. So the Western Wind and Solar Integration Study looked at the impact of integrating over 30% renewables on the Western grid with a particular emphasis on cycling costs. And what it found that was, although cycling costs did indeed increase as you add renewables onto the grid, the value of offset fuel from your VRE resources was at least an order of magnitude greater in value than the additional cost incurred from cycling. The study also found that at those levels of penetration, very little curtailment of VRE was necessary, meaning that the grid could accommodate that much VRE without sort of additional sources of flexibility, just by using inherent flexibility that already exists on the grid. So sort of the natural extension after looking at the Western US is to study the Eastern interconnection of the US. The complication is that the east is roughly 3 or 4 times as big as the Western interconnection, and arguably the largest power system in the world. But NREL used sort of pioneering modeling techniques to look at levels of 30% wind and solar in the eastern US as well. And many of the same trends emerged from those that we saw in the western US. So specifically that 30% levels of VRE was balanceable with very little curtailment. Thermal generation required more cycling and perhaps different operating schemes, maybe turning off more often, et cetera. But no terrifying integration issues were revealed here either. So after 30%, we kind of found ourselves moving onward and upward in terms of RE generation. We look a lot in detail at the state of California. So this is a state that has very aggressive long-term emissions and renewable energy targets. In fact, many of you may have heard they're going to 100% with their latest renewable portfolio requirement. But at the time when they were considering adopting a 50% RPS, NREL did some analysis to look at 55% renewables on the system and found that 55% doesn't necessarily have to be scary. It might require new operating practices, such as more interaction with the neighboring states, allowing must-run thermal generation to turn off, et cetera. If California continues many of its kind of conventional operating techniques, 55% renewables could result in significant curtailment. So that is obviously curtailing renewables is not helpful to California achieving its goals. However, sort of updating its operational practices leads to much lower levels of curtailment. And in fact, in many of our cases, we found less than 1% curtailment, even at 55% renewable generation. Which just indicates the importance of adopting your operating techniques as penetrations of renewables continue to increase. So to zero in on California even further, we conducted more follow-on analysis related to high PV deployment in California. Obviously, California has a very good solar resource combined with aggressive policies intended to deploy renewables. Meaning that it's seeing a dramatic change in the shape of its net load. Maybe many of you have seen this graph before. This is demand on the electricity system minus contributions from wind and solar, in this case, a lot of solar. And we can see that the net load shape changes dramatically as you add solar. Another way to think of the net load profile is sort of the amount of generation that must be met by the rest of the generator fleet. And this new shape of the net load reveals a lot of potential integration challenges and even has a name just due to its distinct properties. It's called the duck curve. Hopefully my artwork helps to illustrate that. But some of our work at NREL helped to identify potential ways to mitigate the shape of the duck, which I'll mention briefly here, but sort of generally fall into 2 categories as either fattening or flattening the duck. So fattening the duck, that's in reference to the belly of the duck, that's the bottom part of that curve in the middle of the day. And fattening the duck would basically allow more solar onto the grid during the middle of the day by decreasing system minimum generation levels. So that could be achieved by improving PV forecasts, so you feel comfortable in turning off your conventional thermal generators, and requiring less reserves from that thermal generator fleet, which has the same effect, the effect of just accommodating more daytime solar. Another solution to the duck shape of the net load curve is to flatten the duck. And if that's hard to imagine, you kind of look at the head of the duck and imagine giving the duck a haircut, which would involve moving demand from the peak of the day to the middle of the day. So shifting supply and demand patterns to better align with when you have energy available. So that could be enabled by technologies such as energy storage, storing energy in the middle of the day, and then using it after the sun is set or when it is setting, or using responsive demand. So that could be encouraging consumers of electricity to move their consumption towards the middle of the day through time of use rates or in perhaps even utility control of certain industries. So some other considerations might be to deploy a more balanced mix of renewable energy in the first place, rather than so PV heavy. Perhaps looking at different types of RE, which might have a higher capital cost, but would potentially help in terms of diversity of supply. California must continue to trade energy with its neighbors, perhaps offloading some solar in the middle of the day. That's already starting to happen as they expand their energy imbalance market. But many of California's neighbors also have a good solar resource and continue to see increased deployment of solar as well. So that can help to some extent, but it might not be, the only solution. But the bottom line is really that California must weigh the costs of these solutions with the benefits to determine the best way for them to integrate more renewables onto the system, especially as they head towards 100%. And sort of speaking of non-solar renewable energy options, the Western US has an excellent wind resource as well as solar. But unfortunately, most of the wind is located in the Rocky Mountain states, and most of the people live on the West Coast. So NREL has done some analysis looking at long distance transmission to bridge the gap between the supply of excellent wind resources to where the demand is. And generally, we find that transmission makes a lot of sense from an economic point of view, but the barriers facing long distance transmission here in the US are non-technical. Often they're sort of permitting and regulatory when you're crossing hundreds to thousands of miles. Siting and permitting can become kind of an insurmountable barrier, meaning that it remains to be seen whether or not this transmission will actually be built. And just to wrap up, I would like to conclude that NREL integration studies going back many years say that we don't necessarily have to be scared of integrating renewables onto the grid because current grid infrastructure can actually accommodate more renewables than perhaps we give it credit for, and up to 30% perhaps with the existing flexibility that we have. A transmission and storage can help with these types of integration issues and might be necessary at higher levels of RE. But it's also important to keep in mind that renewable energy integration issues don't have a one-size-fits-all solution. Every system has unique challenges, but that doesn't mean that all of these studies can't inform a broader audience. And finally, we've looked at 50% RE and even higher, and we'll continue to do so with our body of work occurring at the lab, which is summarized on this last slide. I won't discuss it further in the interest of time. So I will just say thank you. I'm happy to be here, and I will answer any questions during the panel portion of this webinar, or questions at any time via my email address, which is on this last slide. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jenny. That was very interesting, a brief account of some of the work that NREL has been doing in the US. Which is applicable in many ways to many other countries. Before asking Daniel to make his presentation, let me encourage people again to send in questions. We have some that have started to come in, but you have the opportunity to take advantage of these two expert presenters. So please go ahead and send questions. Daniel, go ahead with introducing yourself and making your presentation.
Yeah, hi everyone. First, let me share what I have here for you. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you also to Jenny for that really interesting presentation. So I'm going to hopefully try to take what Jenny said, which had some more of the technical details, and focus a little bit more on what that means in planning processes and policy measures from sort of the government side of things, agencies, ministries, even vertically integrated utilities, those sort of things. And just to specify, we'll be focusing on variable renewables. And so that's going to refer to wind and solar PV mainly, although hydro, if it's a run-of-river hydro plant, would also fall under that category to some extent. But before going into the content, maybe I can say a little bit about Irena. It's an international organization, so it's supported by governments of our member countries. And right now it's almost universal membership with 182 countries either in the process of signing up or signed up to the agency. The headquarters are in Abu Dhabi, but as Jonathan mentioned, I'm here in Bonn in the Innovation and Technology Center. And the mandate for the agency is to support sustainable deployment of 6 of the renewable energy resources. So sometimes we forget, but renewable energy includes all of these things: biomass, geothermal, hydro, ocean, solar, and wind. And so we are dealing with all of those things here at the agency in 4 broad areas of work. We've considered excellence for energy transformation. This is exploring different energy system transformation pathways. And under there, it includes planning and policies for variable renewable energy, integration into the grid, communicating renewables, becoming networking for various members, private sector, and other organizations, and then a source of advice and support, building capacity with our member states. But the topic of transforming the energy system is very complicated, and it's quite wide-ranging. What we focus on here in the Innovation and Technology Center in a little bit more detail is the power sector, specifically within the energy sector. And we approach it from a few different levels. First, since it's kind of a wide-ranging problem, there's issues of market design, regulation, business models. And then in long-term thinking, there's long-term expansion of power systems. On a more sort of short-term basis, you have to understand how you're dispatching and allocating your resources, supply and demand in shorter time scales. And there's a team that works specifically with models that work in those problems. And then there's also technical grid studies which deal with more electricity issues when we're talking about integrating variable renewables like wind and solar on the grid. There are some specific issues related to that are also dealt with here. And the main purpose of all of this here is to improve the representation of renewables in scenarios, in long-term plans, just so that policies can be supported with better information and the transition to a more renewable penetration can happen more smoothly. And so we work with countries to conduct studies using power sector modeling tools, and we develop certain guidelines, tools, and methodologies to help support that. But maybe you're wondering why Irena is working on variable renewable integration in the grid. It makes sense that NREL is a technical laboratory with a lot of engineers, dedicated people who are in the details. But what we found when we were engaging with our member states is that while maybe conventionally in their planning processes or their policy development, they had a very good understanding of thermal plants, so this could be coal or gas plants, and their models and their policies took into account specific costs, specific technical parameters. What we found when we looked and asked about how they represented wind or solar PV, it was almost the exact opposite. If there was anything included at all, sometimes you would just have one generic cost for all of these technologies, one generic type of generation, regardless of where your solar plant was or your wind plant was. And so this was kind of how we approached it, why we got into this topic. And initially, what we like to start with is sort of the planning process. So what happens when a government agency, ministry, or a vertically integrated utility wants to expand its electric power supply to meet future demand? Usually a lot of these organizations conduct long-term studies and then various other studies. And what this shows here is kind of the typical process, at least historically, how this would work. You would have a model that would look long-term into the future, maybe in the time resolution of seasons, years, hours, and then you would kind of get a sense of what type of power generation capacity you would need, say 10 years from now. And then you could take a look based on that amount, and you could say, well, what geospatial planning do we need to do to accommodate that? Do we need to expand our transmission network? Once you had an idea of what the transmission network looks like, then you say, okay, what does production within that network look like at the level of minutes and hours? And what do we need to maybe plan for on that scale? And then there are two further levels, static and dynamic grid models, which deal with some of those electricity issues that I was talking about. So those are very detailed engineering issues at the level of milliseconds even, or minutes. And this whole process, when you introduce variable renewable energy like wind and solar, has to change in many different ways. And a lot of that has to do with the unique sort of impacts that Jenny was talking about. In the long term, you need to start thinking, if my solar is producing at high levels, what happens at night? Do I need to add additional capacities, what we call firm capacity, to make sure demand can be met with supply at all times? Is the location of these different resources something that requires new transmission in geospatial planning? Or, as Jenny mentioned, new sources of flexibility in the level of hours and production cost modeling. And then when you get to high levels of penetration, there are issues with potentially enhancing your transmission network or introducing some stability measures for balancing at small scales. And ideally, technically, sometimes these different stages are conducted by different people, different organizations within a government, and it would be much more improved if we were able to coordinate across these stages and provide feedback between them. And so, of course, it would be perfect if we could plan ahead for all of these issues. But one of the things that gets confusing is, while it's great to plan ahead and know what to expect when you're integrating variable renewables, it's a question of what policy measures and when do you need to implement them to deal with these things. And so to go from more of the policy side of things, one of the good frameworks to look at this is, and it reflects a lot of what Jenny was talking about, there are different contexts for different policy solutions and different phases, if you want to call it, for different levels of integration of wind and solar PV. And the challenges depend on which shares of wind and solar PV are in a certain country or power system. And those policies and measures should adapt to that. So for example, what you see here is a list of countries and then a percentage of variable renewable energy penetration. And what you could say is phase one is between 0 and 5% sometimes, is really no relevant impact. The impact of wind and solar is no different, say, for swings in demand that a system is completely accustomed to dealing with. Phase two, perhaps you start to see this, the duck curve begin, where you have an impact on the net load that's more severe than expected. So what other sources of generation in the system have to do to accommodate wind and solar generation, which can't necessarily be controlled? You might have to change those practices. This could just mean existing flexibility resources are used more often. Certain plants are changing their operating system. But then as you move past, say, 10% penetration to generation, then new sources of flexibility begin to become important. And that's where we can talk about things like storage or new flexible generators. And then certain countries, even right now, are in something that could be called phase 4, all the way up to even nearly 50% of penetration into generation using wind and solar PV. And there is when sometimes you get into the more technical difficulties with things like inertia or short-term balancing issues and need to deal with frequency and voltage items. And that's when there are specific technical measures that are being used right now and are known that are able to address that. And before going into more of those types of approaches and the measures to address it, it's important to realize that we're not only talking about, say, a power plant. The system-wide approach is really important to this integration process. And so while there is what you could call hardware, which is sort of the grid itself, dispatchable generation, like a biomass plant or a hydro plant. There's storage, of course. There's also a software component, which is the way the system is operated, the way the market rules are formulated. And then there's an overall architecture, which is what the stakeholders are doing, what the standards are for different parts of grid operation and generation. And those things can also be changed to accommodate greater penetration of variable renewable energy like wind and solar PV. And so these different layers are not just there, they also influence each other. And it's important to look at the problems that you're facing in a consistent way across these different layers. And so what kind of measures could be taken? This is just a view of what a more specific list, what you could call a supply curve of different integration options for wind and solar PV. And you can see going from left to right, starting with system operation to storage at the other end. You'll see some of the things are the least expensive, don't have to do with adding a new power plant or adding a new amount of storage onto the grid. It could be something that is usually less expensive in terms of hardware, like system operation, as improving your renewable energy forecasting, or changing market structure. You could then go into services from renewables themselves. So wind and solar increasingly can provide certain parts of technical elements to address the issues, such as frequency support or voltage support. The load can also be an extremely important resource in providing flexibility into the grid. And those things from 0 to say 10% of penetration of wind and solar can often make up a lot of the ground in addressing the issues that might be perceived. And then once you get to greater shares of wind and solar that were discussed in Jenny's presentation, then you can think about what new flexible generation might we need in terms of existing assets. Do we need to change the way our hydro is operated? Even here, other renewables are extremely important. So not only hydro, but biomass, even concentrated solar power with storage is another flexible source. And then as you get further down the line, there are things that you can do with transmission and storage, which can kind of extend the supply of flexibility and work on shifting some of the demand. And to get into some more detail quickly, because I think the time is a bit up, this is just an idea of how you can start from the beginning, before thinking about, do we need to invest in a utility scale battery? What does our market design even look like? And is it accommodating for new wind and solar PV generation? And so what this shows is a long and medium term and short term parts of market operation. And also VRE characteristics. So while there is long-term variability in wind and solar, this could be potentially addressed by capacity markets, so procuring backup capacity for the future, forward markets in the energy market, and just strategic reserves in general that could address a lot of these issues. And then when you think about characteristics of VRE that are sort of the day ahead or within the hour, there's short-term variability and uncertainty in when generation will come into the grid. And perhaps that could just simply be addressed by reforming the market to be a day-ahead market or an intraday market to provide greater flexibility. And that could be in a lot of different ways. It could just be regulation. It could just be in the operation side of trading. And so this is just kind of a first look at what options are available. I think the kind of the conclusion is that you don't necessarily need to worry too much about the more serious issues if you're starting from a low baseline. And also looking ahead, we don't necessarily know if this picture will be exactly the same. This is a study from Euroelectric on what we could look like in 2050 if there's greater electrification of other end uses, other consumption. So this is things like replacing fossil fuels in transport sector or in industrial use. If you look to 2050 and there's potential for the EU to decarbonize 90 or indeed 100%, that could mean that other sectors have electrified to the levels of potentially 60% compared to 22 or around 20 right now. And that actually opens up a lot of different options in terms of flexibility resources, or a lot of different issues, if you want to think about it that way, in how the contribution of wind and solar generation influences these new pieces of demand. And just to finish, these are 2 reports that we have worked on here at Irena that cover these issues of what I just talked about in much, much more detail. Planning for the Renewable Future, which goes into modeling and planning processes to integrate variable renewable power. And then renewable energy policies in a time of transition. This goes more into the policy solutions that I discussed. Here is my contact info. As Jenny said, I'm also very happy to discuss any questions and answer anything through email as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for a very interesting presentation. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions about it. One thing that really strikes me from both presentations is how quickly things are changing and how much more complicated planning for change is becoming. So even in countries where the current penetration level of variable renewables is not yet very high, it can rise so fast, and it can even be optimal for it to rise so fast because solar PV and wind in particular are getting cheaper and cheaper very, very rapidly. So integrating variable renewables into the grid in the sense of the operations, in the sense of the planning, in the sense, as Daniel said towards the end of his presentation, of thinking about the most appropriate market design, which in many countries can be the thing that takes the longest to change, even more than the sort of technology-based solutions. I think the bottom line conclusion from all that is the earlier that countries start thinking about these issues and thinking about how to change their practices, their planning, their technology, their markets, etc., the better. So even if a problem doesn't seem very urgent today in a particular country, it can become urgent so fast that you might end up wishing that you'd thought about it a lot earlier. So we have a couple of questions. There's one question that says, and I'll put this to both panelists, to both Jenny and Daniel, is it possible to achieve the renewable energy penetration without energy storage playing a key role? And I'd like to add a related question to that, which is in most countries, people produce power system plans, I mean, least cost generation expansion plans or network plans, master plans, etc., etc. I personally yet to see one that integrates energy storage into the planning process systematically. But I would think that very soon some countries are going to start doing that. So, you might have a least cost generation expansion plan and you say, well, let's look at the different generation technology options, but let's also, along with that, look at the different energy storage technology options. So let's take those two questions together, and I'll ask both Jenny and Daniel to answer. Maybe Jenny first, since she presented first. Is it possible to achieve renewable energy penetration without storage? And how should storage figure in the future in system planning exercises?
Sure, I think that's a really important question, and a question that is, sort of really, really visible right now, because a lot of things are happening with storage. possibly the cost of batteries is going down dramatically. So I think what this question really gets at is sort of, and I think the answer to this question would vary region by region. But I think a lot of the NREL integration studies have found that without energy storage, we can get to a higher level than perhaps we originally thought. I do think that there's likely some magic number. I don't know what that number is, and I'm sure it varies by region, where it wouldn't be possible to get much higher just because you have you have a mismatch in supply and demand. You can rearrange when your demand is occurring to some extent, but I do think that there will be some level, again, not sure where it would occur, where you would definitely need to consider energy storage. I think solar has more obvious and is more obviously easily paired with storage, because we all know that solar has a diurnal curve. You can store relatively, in terms of energy, lower amounts of energy to be paired with solar. However, when we think about wind energy, when excess wind energy occurs, it often lasts for days and possibly even weeks at a time, which makes sort of at least the obvious pairings with batteries a little bit less straightforward. Could use some more long-term storage potentially. Again, I'm not sure what those might look like. Could be hydrogen, could be some large reservoirs for hydro pumped storage. But I think where that is going, I think there is some point in which we would have to consider storage, but maybe that's further down the road, at least where we are here in the US. And it was also a little bit, we're not giving ourselves enough credit because we do have some storage here at the grid in the US. We have some pumped storage, which helps a lot as well. So at the moment, energy storage, maybe not, but I'm sure there's a point down the road where it will become a really important part of our integrating strategies.
Yeah, maybe I can build on that. And also to start with, the question is it possible to achieve renewable energy penetration without energy storage? I think if we're talking about all renewable energies, then of course, absolutely it would be. Each renewable energy technology has very different properties, and there are biomass and hydro plants that function very much in the same way as conventional plants do. And that means that systems don't necessarily have the issues that storage would need to address as you integrate wind and solar. But if we're talking about only variable renewable energy, like can you have a 100% system of only wind and solar, then that is a totally different question. And like Jenny said, you can play with the demand side of things a lot to help, and the complementary generation profiles of wind and solar mean that if you have a large enough balancing area, where you're getting a large enough amount of different types of wind and solar generation profiles, that could help a lot as well in terms of getting consistent supply. But if it's an isolated system, usually what you see in small islands, for example, that actually do have a lot of wind and solar penetration, is that there is some sort of storage paired for those extreme times where you might not have enough generation. And then it's an interesting question about planning for this, specifically for storage, because like you said, it's definitely true. There aren't many dedicated plans for, say, batteries or other new types of advanced storage. But it's also, I guess, the case that a lot of countries around the world have good experience with hydro as a storage option, and their planning for new generation assets actually has incorporated planning for storage in many different ways, in very advanced ways. In Brazil, for example, they have a long history of planning different reservoir dispatching and expanding for the future. So I think there are a lot of lessons to learn from countries that have already dealt with, at least theoretically, the same issues that storage could address. But for the smaller things, like what we think about storage now, something like battery storage, something behind the meter in someone's house, Right now, that's actually mainly being discussed in distribution plans. So distribution level, so beyond the large transmission lines, the people who are dealing with these problems the most right now are the distribution companies or the distribution agencies that are planning the new future distribution expansion. And they've started to integrate new considerations of storage into their plans. So sort of how it could help sort of maybe substitute for the expansion of distribution network in some places. But more and more at the transmission level and at a national level, they're starting to realize that storage should become a bigger part of the planning, not only sort of this distributed level, which might be smaller and very regional in some places.
Okay, thank you very much. Very good responses to the questions. I actually have a follow-on question, if I may. You know, we can talk a lot about how power system planning, you know, at the center of a system should be done in future. But in many countries, in reality, there's quite a shortage of, you know, qualified and trained people to do power system planning, and for that matter, sometimes to do power system operations. And if those countries are wanting to rapidly increase the penetration of variable renewables for economic reasons, because variable renewables, particularly PV and wind, are just becoming so cheap and are becoming, in some sense, least cost solutions. There's a question, I think, that's emerging in a number of countries, which is, should one always try to solve these planning problems at the center, at the level of a system? Or are there things that one can sort of delegate to the private sector to help solve at a project level? In other words, if you contract with the private sector through some competitive process or otherwise, and say, look, we want you to provide more or less firm power, dispatchable power, using renewables and using some kind of storage option. So to save us the challenge of figuring all this out at a system level, could you figure it out based on your experience and your expertise in this domain? Do you think there's a role for, in other words, sort of delegating parts of the planning process to those who may be more able to figure out how to integrate variable renewables at the project level instead of having to figure it out, you know, holistically at the system level? I don't know, Daniel or Jenny, you want to address that question?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because the approach definitely isn't the same. There are so many different contexts that power systems take. There are purely market-driven environments where, for example, a lot of the planning is done through the government saying we simply need this amount of supply in the future, and we're tendering for that amount, and we will see what options are presented from the private sector. The UK has some of these elements, as well as Colombia had some, which are being under review. But this is something that is kind of a way to cut the responsibility from the central agency or central ministry in the planning process. And it's not only sort of an issue to deal with generation, so new wind and solar. It's also with new wind and solar, especially solar, a lot of the, let's say, the level of demand that is the responsibility of a central agency is actually shrinking, because these distributed generators, even mini-grids are being built by private sector. Let's, if you give an example in sub-Saharan Africa, where it's very expensive or unlikely that the central grid will be extended. People are taking advantage of business opportunities and new service models to essentially have distributed mini grids that aren't connected to the central planning process in any way. And that's happening organically. Like you said, it's something that now you have to deal with reactively if you're a planning agency or a government. And so even if there's little capacity to deal with the integration of wind and solar, I think having all of these things in mind is a relatively quick thing that could be done with research trainings, just attending things like this if you're interested. And then speaking to different stakeholders. That's probably the best first step that you could do to learn a lot about the context.
Okay, thank you. Jenny, before I ask you to respond to that also, Daniel, you might notice in the Q&A box, there's a question on mini-grids that you might want to reply to after Jenny has talked about this one. Jenny, please go ahead.
Sure. I don't think I have all that much to add to what Daniel and you have already said. I mean, I think I would just like to emphasize that there's often a disconnect between the planning entity and then sort of the technical field. So, for instance, if we're talking about the state of California, California has been mandated to get to 100% renewables, but California is not its own grid. It is part of a larger interconnected grid. Electrons don't know anything about state borders. And so this is still an open, I think, an evolving issue, which is how do you deal with planning for a section of a much larger puzzle, basically. And so I think a lot of that still remains to be seen, and we can look at lessons learned from other places that have successfully integrated 100% renewables, knowing that California is going to have to be different because it is not isolated. It can't isolate itself electrically.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, there's also a question, I think it's in the chat box, that's about if either of you have comments on the interaction between national aspects and regional aspects. I know California is not exactly a nation, but sometimes one might think that it is, and certainly it's the size of a nation. But as you were saying, there's the question of interaction between California and the sort of larger region. Daniel, did you want to respond to that one about mini grids?
Yeah, sure. So this is a question from Marcus about if you can't see it and you're just listening in, it's about experience implementing distributed energy resource or resource, or usually a lot of that is renewables, clustered interconnected mini grids in a non-third world country. And I can give a good example, at least, not necessarily about the dynamics, but a good example is occurring close to where I am in Belgium. There's a research center called VIDO. It's the Belgian Energy Research Center, where they're working in their campus and with the surrounding local and regional area to develop this exact sort of thing. So it's a distributed mini grid, but it's clusters of various mini grids for different purposes, because it is actually a high demand area. There are some industrial applications. They have sort of commercial services on their campus and in the surrounding area. And they're working on integrating increasing amounts of wind, solar, storage into those mini grids, along with some very advanced forecasting and data management services to try to see how to get something like this to work at 100% renewables. So how can we work, especially within the regulations? Because when you're in a very highly developed market, there are a lot of regulations that probably prevent this sort of mini grid that could feed into the grid to even being built. And so they're dealing with a lot of those issues. They have some very interesting cases, experiences. So it's, again, the group is VITO, V-I-T-O, and the campus is called Energyville. it's actually an interesting case.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. Do either of you, Jenny or Daniel, want to comment on? There's a question in the chat box that I just briefly referred to. It says, "Can you say anything on regional versus national aspects?" I'm assuming that means region in the sense of a group of countries rather than a region within a country. But can you say anything about essentially interconnections between countries and trade, exchange of energy between countries as a way of managing variable renewables in a grid?
Yeah, I can start. I think that we've sort of already covered this a little bit, so maybe Daniel has more to add. But I think, so greater interconnection, greater trading with neighbors is all sort of a part of the broader puzzle to integrating more renewables. There's a lot of things that become more optimal when you can share things with your neighbors. You might be able to share reserves, meaning that you yourself need less reserves to hold on your own system. You might get the effect sort of geographical diversity, meaning it might not be sunny where you are, but it might be sunny, a few miles away, and you can sort of deal with variability in a more effective way when a lot of that variability might actually be lessened from the fact of geographical smoothing. So I feel, if I understand the question, I think that although a lot of in the U.S. a lot of things are happening on a regional or local basis, meaning municipalities are wanting to get to 100% renewables. Again, doing that without the help of whoever you're interconnected to is going to be much harder. So I see that as a really important piece in integrating renewables is enhanced coordination, better planning, not just sort of operating in a vacuum and that kind of thing.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. Daniel, did you want to add anything?
Maybe just to give an example of where this does come into play. You might have seen in one of the charts of the two nations with the highest penetration right now. One of them is Denmark, with a very large amount of wind generation. And that is really enabled by the fact that they are interconnected with neighboring countries in the region. And so when, for example, this amount of wind is potentially too much for the Danish system or Danish consumers, it's exported and vice versa. And so that's something, like Jenny said, that definitely, it takes planning, because otherwise uncoordinated imports and exports just simply don't really work, and it causes a lot of countries to grow skeptical of energy security issues. And so once maybe these different regional and national planning processes are combined, for example, NSOE, the European transmission system, has a very nice planning process where they explore future scenarios for variable renewable energy penetration, all different types of energy system evolutions, and they do that at the regional level, but harmonized with national plans. So there's definitely some good experience out there if that's something people are interested in.
Ah, okay, that's very interesting to know, because my impression is that many countries are watching the costs of variable renewables falling rapidly and thinking how to integrate them, and are starting to realize that it also requires rethinking the desirability of interconnections and trade with neighboring countries that may, in that particular region, have historically not been a high priority for various sort of energy security type reasons or political reasons or whatever, but it changes the balance of costs and benefits and changes perceptions of risks. I think similarly, countries are starting to think, well, we haven't really been pursuing market options. We haven't really been pursuing the creation of competitive markets at the sort of wholesale or retail level. The various benefits and costs and risks of that set of reforms is also changing because of its potential role in helping to integrate variable renewables in the most, the cost-effective way, the least cost way. So there are many things that are changing. I mean, the value of planning, the complexity of planning, the ability to cope with the complexity of planning, all changing a lot as a kind of knock-on effect of variable renewables becoming so cheap. So we have some other questions in the Q&A box. So let me throw one at you, which you may or may not feel able to respond to. There's one that says, can you comment on high renewable energy penetration planning in the Middle East, namely Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait? These countries have relatively good grids. They're trying to convert energy sources to renewables. What would you advise them? Don't know if either of you want to take that one. It may not be your sort of area of the world.
Well, our headquarters is in Abu Dhabi, so I think
then you're obliged to answer.
Yeah. No, these are most of the countries in the Middle East are members of Irena, and they're extremely interested, like you mentioned, about planning for wind and solar, and of course, particularly solar PV and other solar technologies. So in the UAE, for example, they also see this as an opportunity to reduce energy security concerns in terms of relying on one particular energy source of supply. They also see it as a very important socio-economic opportunity to improve the industrial base, develop advanced solar technology. And so I think they definitely don't even need advice to look toward a higher renewable energy future. There's a lot of excitement about how much solar technology can be built. That's not only even solar PV, but concentrated solar power as well. And like you said, they have good grids, and not necessarily a big leap. I think the biggest leap that they definitely realize themselves is sort of an economic one, a political one, about how you transfer a larger part of the society, not just power sector, from something that was so reliant on fossil fuels to something that's now going to be renewable. But I think what is most exciting for them is the opportunity in terms of new technology and not being so heavily reliant on one source of energy.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I would also add that some of the countries are clearly focused on renewable energy as a domestic source of supply, replacing fossil fuels, but not necessarily to reduce their overall reliance on fossil fuels, but more to be able to export more fossil fuels rather than burning them at home, which from a revenue point of view, if not from an environmental point of view, but from a revenue point of view, can be a major benefit. We're running over time. I don't know, Jenny, if you wanted to react briefly to the last question, to add to anything that Daniel.
No, I think that was a good summary. I was also going to just throw in a quick, just mention concentrated solar power, thermal energy storage. I think those regions, what they have in common is a really good solar resource. And what CSP could provide is a less variable form of renewable generation that could potentially help balance out potential variability from PV in places that have really good solar resources, even though the capital cost is still pretty high.
Yeah, no, that's right. And we saw last year a huge CSP project in Dubai. I mean, 700 megawatts, which is by far the largest CSP plant in the world, at a price that, frankly, makes it competitive with gas-fired power. I mean, it's at 7.3 US cents a kilowatt hour for solar power that is targeted primarily at supplying during the night. So nighttime solar at 7.3 cents. That's something that I think other countries in the Gulf and elsewhere in the world that has a good resource for CSP that really sort of watching and seeing whether they want to try and replicate that, because there are plenty of countries that have a far better resource for CSP than actually Dubai has. Let me draw this to a close. I'm seeing that we've actually gone a little bit over time. I think we could probably carry on discussing this for hours, but definitely the conclusion that I'm coming away with is that thinking about the topic of integrating variable renewables into the grid leads to re-examining so many other topics and so many other policies or strategies that countries have had often for a long time. It really does cause a rethink of many things, from planning to markets to regional trade and relationships with neighbors. So let me thank our panelists, Jenny and Daniel, very much. Let me thank all the participants that we've had, and let me close the session here. We will, of course, be sending the PowerPoints to everyone, and everyone will receive a link to a recording of this session if you want to share it with others or review certain points. Thank you very much. Goodbye to everybody.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks.